Good evening and welcome to the first of two final Inside Government shows for the fall 2017 season here at Cayuga Community College. They're broadcast on Spectrum, Verizon Fios, the Auburn Regional Media Access, better known as ARMA, as well as Win 89, the college's radio station. I'm Guy Cosentino. In less than 45 days, the New York State Legislature returns to Albany to start a new session. Among the issues facing Albany is putting their 2018-2019 fiscal plan in place by April 1st, while possibly facing a $4 billion gap between revenues and expenditures. We are delighted to finish one of these two shows for the fall of 2017 with a friend of ours, New York State Senator James L. Seward, who represents the 51st Senate District, a Republican who succeeded Steve Ryford so many years ago here in Cayuga County in 1986, where he was the Chief of Staff for the Senator. He represented Cayuga County for about 5 years. For the last 20 years he didn't, and then he came back to represent us again in 2013. We've asked the Senator on, who is the chairman of the Senate Insurance Committee, to talk about the last legislative session as well as what to expect when they return in January. Welcome back to the studio.
Well, thank you, Guy. It's great to be back, and it's great to be back in Cayuga County these last number of years since 2012, to have, during that reapportionment year, to have Cayuga County, or portion of the county, basically the eastern shores of Owasco Lake.
Go down to Moravia.
Moravian Lock on the southern end, and Sempronius and Summer Hill as well.
So how many people do you roughly represent in a Senate district?
Just about 300,000 people.
And when you first started in '86, was it how many people back then?
It was slightly less than that.
Okay.
But of course, in the upstate region, to come up with 300,000 people, you have to travel quite a distance unless you're taking a big
district. So your district goes from the city line in Auburn down to where?
On the eastern end is Ulster. I have 4 towns in Ulster County. So I'm actually near Kingston. Down in the Hudson Valley, in terms of the eastern end of
so
the
bigger
district.
than a state like Delaware.
Absolutely, it's just about the size of Connecticut. Actually.
Connecticut. Okay. Well, let's talk about not the Connecticut legislature. This season kind of ended on time, kind of quickly. No big ugly. I mean, there was some stuff that you needed to get done, but it wasn't a mess as had been done in the decades prior. What was the biggest accomplishment of the legislature this year?
Well, Guy, I think it was the budget that we did in the first few days of April. It was the first late Andrew Cuomo budget. Since Governor Cuomo came in, the budgets have been on time. This one,
but it was in August.
Exactly.
Okay.
It was only, I think, April 9th, which was 9 days after the start of the fiscal year. But that is close enough, obviously, compared to where we had been in New York State in terms of chronically late state budgets. As you point out, even going as late as August on more than one occasion, which isn't fun and not good for the people of the state of New York. But I think the budget wrapped a lot of issues together, which I think are very beneficial for the people of the state. You know, Guy, when I started the session this year in 2017, I was struck by a U.S. Census report that had come out just about this time last year. And that was that between July 2015 and July 2016, no fewer than 191,000 people had migrated out of the state of New York. In other words, picked up and left the state. And many of those people were from the upstate region. Many of the counties right in that surround us here in Cayuga, including Cayuga and throughout my district, had actually lost population. And why do people leave? Now, this is something I think policy makers need to be cognizant of as we proceed with the people's business at the state capitol. Why do people leave? I think certainly the weather in some cases may have something to do with it. But let's face it.
As we're giving you a sauna in here right now because we can't regulate our heat in this building.
It's plenty warm here, but more than the weather, let's face it, I think people leave to seek better opportunities elsewhere and also to move to a location which is more affordable. for them to live and to work and to raise a family and conduct business. And so I think that is why we in Albany have got to come to grips with these two main overriding issues. Now that is creating more opportunities for our people, and number two, making our state more affordable. And we did continue to make some progress in this year's state budget. I was pleased that the budget for the 7th year in a row did include a cap on spending, the growth of state spending at no more than 2%. We had rejected millions and millions of dollars of new taxes and fees that the governor had recommended. We continued with the STAR program, which helps homeowners pay with their school taxes, gives them a break on their school taxes. The governor wanted to make some changes there which would have eroded the benefits of the STAR program. We rejected those. We protected the middle class tax cut, which is due to kick in starting January 1st, right around the corner. I know they're talking about tax cuts and changes down in Washington.
We'll get to that in a minute.
We've already done it here in New York with a good, solid middle-class tax cut. So those are all moves in the right directions. At the same time in the budget, we were able to find the money for a record amount of spending, $2.5 billion for clean water initiatives, which are going to help us here in Keokuk County with the Owasco Lake issue. There's monies already set aside from that fund to help with the water plant for the city of Auburn as well as the town of Owasco.
So let's slice and dice some of these things.
Sure.
So let's deal with clean water right off the bat.
Sure.
So you represent an area that has a number of lakes in it. I believe every lake has had some level of these green algae blooms in them. They haven't been at the focal point that they were this year, maybe because in central New York, Skinny Atlas was for the first time hit, and you have part of your district that abuts Skinny Atlas Lake. Is this issue more than just local regulation, but more so that the state has to take a policy stand on whether it's development or whether it's agriculture when it comes to this issue of how do you protect the lakes?
Well, we're very focused on the Owasco Lake issues, and I'm very pleased that since the years that I have come back into Keokuk County, we have directed some significant funding toward our local problem. $200,000 directed toward the Dutch Hollow watershed initiative, which is going to help eliminate and decrease the number of nutrients that are flowing into the lake from the Dutch Hollow watershed. More recently, $600,000 directed toward help for the lake.
And that was for Owasco and for Auburn. That's the money you were talking about that came in back in June.
Yes, there's $600,000 for the lake, and then of course there are additional funding from
separate from that.
Separate from that to help fund improvements to the water treatment plant for the city of Auburn as well as the town of Owasco, all directed to not only identifying what the problems are with Owasco Lake, but also making sure that we improve the quality of the water there for recreation purposes. But what makes Owasco different, and I think, of course, with Skinny Atlas as well, these are actually sources of water for
They're not recreational.
Exactly. Recreation is important, obviously, because it's a great drawing card, for our region. But the fact that, let's take Owasco Lake, the source of drinking water for 50,000 people in this region, is very, very critical that we make sure that we improve the quality of the water and make sure that it is safe for people.
But in your mind, is just aid to municipalities for sewer, or not sewer, for water quality issues, is that enough to take care of this problem in the long term? Whether it's algae blooms or whatever, 5 years from now, nobody did you even hear the word algae bloom 5 years ago?
I've learned a lot about
you have.
algae bloom.
So we don't know what in 5
quality.
years or 10 years. So is money the sole solution, or do you have to really deal, and I've asked all of this of everybody, Senator Helming, Senator DeFrancisco, I've asked this of the mayor and others, Keith Batman, everyone. Is it a time for the state to really look at how you regulate, whether it's development, because that's one component, agriculture, for example, while it's Owasco in Auburn can regulate the watershed, really they can only enforce watershed rules. They can only go so far because it's up to the state to allow that. Does the state need to take a bigger role in those areas?
Well, Guy, money is important, obviously, to fund the studies and the implementation of projects that enhance the lake. So state funding coming in to address this problem is important and significant. But long term, and the state has got to become involved, working closely with local officials to solve this problem once and for all, and on a long-term basis. Our Department of Health, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, working closely with local officials to number one, solve this problem, and making sure that some problems are not popping up in the future. In terms of development and best practices, obviously the state has some role here, but we want to work closely with local officials. I think we need to have...
It's that dilemma. Y'all don't trust Albany, but sometimes Albany is the only one who can do to give the overarching.
I think the key here, when it comes to agriculture around the lake, other development around our lakes, I think the key here is to strike the right balance, have best practices in place so that whatever happens either through agricultural pursuits or additional development do not adversely affect the lake. So I am one that believes that clean water and a clean Owasco lake can coexist with agriculture, which is so significant to our region, as well as other development that will benefit the region.
So you said you've learned a lot. So you are most likely bombarded with studies, reports, people giving you phone calls. You're at Owasco Lake Day. You're everywhere, and you hear this. What do you think has caused these algae blooms?
Well, the fact that it has occurred in many of the Finger Lakes and other lakes around the state, I don't think it's a problem peculiar or particular to Owasco Lake. So I think it's a question of the weather, the amount of rain and water that has come into the region. I think there are a lot of contributing factors. I think it's not just the agricultural enterprises that we have around the lake or manure runoff, and I don't think you can pinpoint it to any particular cause.
It tends to be a perfect storm of a lot of different
perfect storm, and I think a lot of it is overall conditions. But we have to be ready for that. We have to respond to it. Because after all, it is the source of drinking water for close to 50,000 people. And of course, that lake is one of our most important natural resources. It draws a lot of people into the region. And while they're here, they spend money. So it's important to our local economic base.
So going back to the legislative session, two follow-up questions. One is, you mentioned there was the proposal for the billionaires tax. There was some delayed tax cuts, all of that stuff. Were there other things that the Senate GOP, in your mind, were able to repel so that the governor couldn't get something through, or the Assembly Democrats couldn't get through?
Well, I think it was the number of fees and other taxes that we were able to block. The governor had suggested changes in the STAR program, which would have eroded the benefits of that program for many people. We certainly block that. And as we move forward with the finalizing a budget, we in the Senate said we need to continue to take steps to help our local economies, particularly in the upstate region. And even though this isn't a particularly sexy issue, but it's a critically important issue for employers, particularly small employers of our region, and that is workers' compensation. That program is very costly for employers. who pay that bill, and we insisted on reforms in the workers' compensation program in New York State that will.
But your conference would have gone farther if you could have.
We always would go further.
Okay. Well, so let me ask you.
But we were able to get some reforms there that's going to save employers some $700 million going forward. So that's another step in the right direction in terms of creating opportunities and making the state more affordable.
So I mentioned items that you may have stopped that the Assembly might have wanted to get through, or the governor. At the same time, were there things that you as a Senate conference wanted to get done, and you couldn't get over the hump of either, whether it was the Assembly, or if you got the Assembly on board, you couldn't get the governor to go ahead?
Well, obviously, we would like to have seen more changes that would help our economic conditions here, particularly in the upstate region. What I mean by that is we would have done more in the workers' compensation area to help with those expenses. Very, very importantly, two other areas that we in the Senate would love to go further and think it's very, very important to the people of the state to go further. One is in the area of regulatory relief. 2 or 3 years ago, we in the Senate had special task force. We identified some 1,000 regulations that are duplicative and outdated, costly, job-killing regulations that we ought to wipe off the books in the state of New York. That would lift a big burden off the backs of both employers and the people of the state. So that's something that we would like to do, which the Assembly and the governor are just not as interested as we are. That's a bit of frustration there. And also in the area of mandate relief, to get unfunded mandates off the backs of local governments. Because
our next guest is a city manager. He might agree with you on this.
I'm sure he will, because unfunded mandates are a real killer for local government officials, and that is one of the drivers in terms of high property taxes in the state. And I would mention one final issue that has left undone in terms of this past session. I serve on the Senate Task Force on heroin and opioid addiction, which is unfortunately a huge problem for us in this area and throughout the state of New York. Now we've taken some significant steps to fight this, what I'd call an epidemic of heroin and opioid addiction, and and that includes prevention, education, treatment opportunities, and support for recovery. But one aspect of this issue that has been left undone because of resistance on the part of the Assembly and to some extent the governor, and that is to come down tougher in the area of law enforcement, not to come down on those that are addicted, but I want to come down harder, and the Senate wants to come down harder on those who profit from and prey upon the addiction of others, the dealers, so to speak,
and the manufacturers.
And the manufacturers. Because I think we need to cut off the supply there, which I think will be part of the long-term answer. We've been unable to get those kind of tough law enforcement provisions through the Assembly. We passed them in the Senate. For example,
they're one House bills.
They're one House bills, which I would like to make 2 House bills. It's been an element of frustration there because, as an example, if a drug dealer sells a heroin or some other deadly drug to someone who then overdoses and loses their life, and we have seen way too much of that right in our own area, I believe that drug dealer ought to be brought up on charges, not only for dealing in drugs, but for actually causing the death of that person. So those are the kind of measures that I think we need to take to, from a law enforcement point of view, help to combat this epidemic.
So you said something interesting a few minutes ago. Many people who come on this show and do Inside Government say they are government officials. Some of them occasionally say they're politicians, but they're politicians and government. You said you were a policymaker. You are the first person in 17 years I've been doing this show who's ever said that here. So with that in mind, which I think is an interesting angle, what do you think are the top 2 or 3 policy issues that the legislature must take up come January 3rd and beyond?
Well, I think we need to do a number of things from a policy point of view. I'm hoping that the next session, we're looking at a tough budget next year.
Do you agree that right now it's a $4 billion gap?
You know, I've seen estimates $4.4 billion all
but
the
it's
way
big.
Down to, well, I've even seen $1.7 billion.
Okay.
You know, the certain revenues are lagging behind what
So
we
is it mainly
anticipated.
expenses are on track, but revenues are lacking?
It's a combination.
Okay.
And if we, as we put together our next state budget, that's going to be, I think, a key issue for us in the 18 session, and particularly with this deficit that's looming out there. The last place that we need to turn to is higher taxes in the state of New York. So as a policymaker, but also I consider myself a public servant, obviously a servant of the people. I think in the best interests of the people of the state, for all the reasons I've mentioned in terms of making our state more affordable, we cannot turn to higher taxes in New York State to close this deficit.
So this would be the, excuse me, President, this would be the 10th budget that the governor will submit, if I'm correct on this. It will be his 10th.
His eighth budget, yeah.
Eighth. He has never faced a gap of this magnitude. Other previous incumbents have. What do you think he proposes? Because you're going to react to what he sends you at the end of, mid to late January. What do you think? How does he close this gap?
That's a good question. We'll know about the third week in January when he presents his
Because he's
budget.
not giving anybody any indication right now, other than blaming Washington.
Exactly. It's going to be interesting. The governor's budget proposal that we'll see third week in January of next year. Not only is it going to be a tough budget year, as we've talked about because of a looming deficit, but it's also an election year. In case
really, all of you
haven't
are
noticed that, the entire state legislature, but also there's a gubernatorial election.
By the way,
and so then there's the prospect: is the Governor Cuomo looking to run for president in 2020?
So do you think he is?
He does not share his.
He does not meet with you on a regular basis to.
Well, we have a good working relationship, but he does not. We don't talk about his political future.
But it's January budget could be a very political budget.
That's what I'm looking at, and it's going to be interesting to see where the governor goes with this. He is, I think, in looking at the, let's say, take the national scene with the success of, shall we say, the Bernie Sanders faction of the National Democrat Party. I think the governor is. Looking to appeal to the, shall we say, the progressive wing there. So some
would say left, but
right. What will that mean? What will that mean? It could very well be tax increases for the first time. Who knows?
But tough to sell to a legislature that's up for re-election.
It is, particularly in the Senate, and other measures that I think will be determined. By just where he's heading in his own re-election, assuming he does run for re-election.
Right. Do you assume he is?
At this point, I am. Okay. But on the other hand, I think it's very difficult to spend 2018 running for re-election
and then shifting.
I mean, the day after the election, if he's serious about running for president, he's going to have to shift gears very, very quickly. All of a sudden, be running for president, and at the same time, when there are something like 20 other Democrats out there that will be already out there.
Well, I was going to ask you a question in regards to, because of the budget, one of the issues has been school aid. And traditionally the governor comes in low, legislature, I think without exception, always adds. When you have possibly a $4 billion shortfall, is that even possible to add money to schools if he comes in low? Because you can't change a lot in the budget. You can shift some stuff around, but it's really tough to do because there are other constituencies fighting for or against those.
Well, it is up to the legislature to establish, the priorities in terms of spending in the state of New York, and Guy, I will plead guilty for fighting for additional dollars for education, because I think that's a real key to our future.
Well, I know
here in
you've
New York
been
State.
meeting with the Auburn district because they have a foundation aid issue, which we'll be
Right.
dealing with in
Right, we do.
February.
We need to make some adjustments in how the Auburn School District is viewed in terms of its level of
Do you think
wealth and income.
Do you think that formula can be changed in Auburn's case?
We're going to work very hard to make that happen, and also continue to make education a spending priority for us in the state budget. Now, we went through years of this gap elimination adjustment, where the state actually withheld aid from the school districts, very devastating to districts, Auburn, Moravia, other districts in our area. I don't want to go back to those days, and so we're going to be fighting very hard for additional education dollars, because I think that's a priority of our constituents, and very much a key to our future.
Are you worried about what may, I know the governor's continually challenging what's coming out of Washington, but are you worried about whether it's the tax bill or the federal spending plan for New York?
We are keeping a close eye on developments in Washington, and this tax bill that's being discussed in Washington, obviously coming from New York, I have concerns about the possible elimination
of the deductions,
of the deduction for state and local taxes. I want to see that continued, because otherwise I see that as double taxation for the people of our state, and could be very, very damaging to a lot of New Yorkers. But there's a long way to go in Washington in terms of the process. And so we will deal with whatever they come up with. But we're keeping a very close eye in terms of that tax bill, and also, of course, the health care debate. That could have some real implications.
Are you supportive of Chris Collins and John Fassler, the most members of the House, their idea of having the state pick up Medicaid versus the localities?
I am. That's been a long-time priority of mine. That would occur under the Collins-Fasso amendment, that outside the city of New York. In other words, it would directly benefit upstate counties, which, if you take Cayuga, for example, Cayuga County, nearly half of the county budget is just in paying the Medicaid expenses for the county. And this is, I think, the Medicaid program is the mother of all mandates.
So you would see that localities, if they were released from that responsibility, they would cut local taxes.
Frankly, I would like to see it as part of the package.
As a requirement.
As a requirement.
Okay.
Unless there's some extenuating circumstances that would allow them to meet other priorities.
I got a minute and a half, and I'm not letting you out of here because of this one item. Have you decided who you're supporting for governor? You got a colleague in the Senate, John DeFrancisco. You got a friend, Brian Kolb, in the Assembly. You've got other individuals. Have you decided who you're supporting for governor yet?
It's way early. No one has actually formally announced. We have a.
Have they been courting you?
I've talked to a number of them, and we are waiting to see just who actually announces. And obviously, we'll make a determination later in the game. But
you'd like to do a pre-convention. You'd like to have a Republican candidate prior to the convention, or you don't care if it goes to the primary?
I frankly think if a primary can be avoided, that would be the best possible scenario, because the governor's, assuming he runs again, he's got what, $28 million already in the bank. I mean, he's going to have a big head start there from a financial point of view. And I think to waste Republican resources on fighting in a primary, I think is counterproductive.
Are you planning on seeking re-election?
Well, I see no reason why I won't.
Okay.
But we're obviously not going to be making any political announcements at this point. I'm focused on next year's budget and the people's business. There'll be time for politics next year.
Do you worry about the president's popularity and how it affects the Senate GOP as you run to try to keep control next year?
You know, Guy, when we get into the elections cycle, I believe that if you take a look at the history in the New York State Senate, we run our own races, we run on our own record, our own vision for the future, And regardless of who's president, who's running for governor at the top of the ticket, I think we will run our own race and hopefully be successful by doing that.
We want to thank you for your time. It's been 30 minutes goes really quick.
It does.
We didn't talk about Thruway. We didn't talk about other state initiatives. We didn't talk about Constitutional Convention. Love to have you back on in the spring. We know it's always tough for you because of the legislative session, but we'd love to have you back here in the spring.
Enjoy the discussion and look forward to another one.
Our guest has been New York State Senator James Seward. We want to thank him for joining us to give us an Albany update. He's also here doing some other tours. In fact, he's going to tour the college in a few minutes, but we do look forward to having him back in the spring. We return in just a moment with our final Inside Government with City Manager Jeff Dygert and Capital Improvements Director Christina Selvik to give us a city update on projects. On Thursday, we have our final Beyond the Front Page show. This is the one the Senator really wanted to be part of, and that was a conversation with our annual last guest of the fall semester, Santa Claus. Before we go, though, if you would like to send some questions to us or give us ideas for next semester of what guests you'd like to see on or what they're asked about, you can contact us at cozguytho@aol.com or Inside Government, 141 Dunning Avenue, Auburn, New York, 13021. I'm Guy Cosentino for Community College. We want to thank you for watching. We hope you stick around, but otherwise we hope you have a good night and have a great tomorrow.